Hello and welcome. Now, recently I did a video titled Patriarchy Theory Debunked and Destroyed, in which I debunked and destroyed the feminist patriarchy theory, right? Like the title suggests. However, some people still don't want to understand and are still in denial and are still coping and still believe we live in a male-dominated society and in a so-called patriarchy, right? I mean, you can see it even on screen, right? Me Too brought down 201 powerful men. Nearly half of their replacements are women. That is a weird male-dominated society in which Me Too can just bring down powerful men like that, right? But regardless of that, my video actually mainly focused on the present day, right? The present day society. But I will now in this video show you a little bit of history, right? Debunk the whole notion and the whole narrative that women were oppressed in the past. Due to the so-called patriarchy, whatever, right? Because let's face it, this feminist narrative is omnipresent and people still believe that bullshit. So, yeah. And I also do this video in response to some comments that I got under this video. Like this one from Valab. This person has written many comments in response to my video, right? I will just read out one of his comments because he has like written whole novels, right? With just assertions, no citations, no sources, nothing, right? So let me just read one comment from this person and then we will debunk systematically what he has said, plus the whole patriarchy narrative once and for all. I will just, seriously, after watching this video, nobody should believe in that bullshit narrative anymore. Nobody, right? I will just bulldoze that feminist narrative of the patriarchy once and for all. Okay? Now let us read this comment here, right? What these people don't see is the elephant in the room, or the simple fact that women simply cannot match or generally lack the testosterone-driven raw masculine power, the physical and mental strength of men as a whole. It made the men to build the world. Its factories, machineries, technologies, buildings, roads, dams, almost all the construction work and more. They are the natural protectors and providers of women, children, and family. Men are, most importantly, the makers of the war machine, soldiers, armies to fight and defend the country, which also include all the internal security forces, the law enforcement police. All of them overwhelmingly consist of men from top to bottom. Above all, the legislators, lawmakers mostly are men, and the women who become the legislators, even the heads, are there only to follow the laws made and endorsed by the men to protect this entire patriarchal dominated society. Most important of all is that the mass media publication printing houses owned and run by majority men. Now this is, end quote. Now this is complete bullshit. From top to bottom, from start to finish, complete nonsense. Because let me show you actually the definitions of patriarchy, right? Because the patriarchy so-called theory, it changes definitions all the time, right? I have just here two definitions to show you. One from Cambridge Dictionary, which says patriarchy, a society in which the oldest male is the leader of the family or a society controlled by men in which they use their power to their own advantage. Okay, and the second definition is from dictionary.com. A social system in which power is held by men through cultural norms and customs that favor men and withhold opportunity from women. Now, these definitions are different and similar, right? But they're very vague, actually. Very vague, right? Because, I mean, let's think about that, right? Because it says here, a social system in which power is held by men through cultural norms and customs. But how do you know that positions of power are occupied by men through cultural norms and customs? It could also have been just the case that through competence and meritocracy, right, that these positions are mainly occupied by men if they are supposedly occupied by men, right? So there's not even any way to test this, actually, right? It just assumes that positions of power are occupied by men through cultural norms and customs, whatever that means, right? And as we have seen from my video, the part about the withholding opportunity from women definitely is not true, right? Governments and all kinds of international organizations constantly push empowerment for women. So that cannot be true, right? This definition fails flat on its face, and this definition here, a society controlled by men in which they use their power to their own advantage, right? I mean, that implies that all men control society, right? And use their power to their own advantage. Then why do we have so many suicidal, homeless men, men who are the majority of homicide victims, and so many disadvantages that men face, right? If society is controlled by men and they use their power to their own advantage, right? So that definition also falls flat on its face and fails, right? And what he said, or what this person Valip here says, right? It's also complete nonsense, because this person, I assume it's probably a tradcon, right? Says that men built all these civilizational achievements, right? The factories, the roads and all of that, the construction work, whatever, right? And that's true. But does that mean we live in a patriarchal society? No, because that just means men worked to build this civilization, right? I mean, patriarchy implies that men are in charge, right? And this person wants to prove that men are in charge due to the fact that they built civilization, right? But this is a horrible argument, because in a slave society, for example, like in ancient Egypt, for example, the slaves built the pyramids, right? But does that mean they were in charge? Were the slaves the pharaohs? No. So that argument is complete bunk, just logically. I don't even need sources for that, but just logically, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? And then he also says they are the natural protectors and providers. That is a naturalistic fallacy, right? So we can just dismiss it on that ground, right? But let's actually look through some history, right? I have many tabs prepared for this, which all contradict patriarchy theory in its entirety, to be honest. So let us look at this, for example. Okay, here are 15 of the most powerful women in history, right? And you can see here, right? Zenobia was the queen of Palmyrene Empire in Syria, right? Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Ptolemaic Egypt. Lakshmi Bai was the queen of India Jhansi state. Joan of Arc was the French heroine and a saint to Roman Catholics. Borgia Eugene was the wife of Genghis Khan. She was one of Genghis Khan, and she was also the empress of the Mongolian Empire, the largest land empire in history. Right? Indira Gandhi, Margaret Thatcher. So if we live in a patriarchy, why is it that these women even got into power? This is kind of weird, isn't it? You know? If this, even in the past, right? Why were these women in power if opportunity was suppressed, right? If women's opportunities were suppressed by men? That's very interesting, isn't it? Now, this commenter Valab also said that men are like these makers of the war machine, right? I mean, men are used as cannon fodder, but does that mean that they are like the main drivers of war, or are and if we would elect women, would they be peaceful and all of that nonsense, right? Let's look at that claim. Queens on attack, right? Would putting more women in power lead to less war? For queens, at least, the answer is no. Right? And these historians analyzed history and they found that queens were 27% more likely to get involved in wars. And they were more likely to start wars, even. Isn't that interesting? But we have even more data, not just from history, right? This is also interesting. And by the way, this is a feminist study here, right? Titled Peacemakers or Iron Ladies, a cross-national study of gender and international conflict. Conventional wisdom suggests that when women attain high political office, they are more likely to act as peacemakers than their male counterparts. In contrast, this article argues that women political leaders may be more likely to initiate conflict than their male colleagues. The theory draws on insights from feminist theory, particularly the notion that gender is performative, to argue that the effects of a leader's gender on foreign policy decision-making vary with social and institutional context. To gain and maintain status in elite policy in-groups, female leaders are incentivized to perform gender by signaling their toughness and competence through initiating conflict. Statistical tests and qualitative case studies of the tenures of Turkish Prime Minister Tansu Çiller and Chilean President Michelle Bachelet provide evidence that female heads of government in democracies are more likely to initiate conflict than their male counterparts, and that this effect is conditioned both by domestic political constraints and overall levels of political women's empowerment. Wow. I mean, this is a feminist article, right? And even this feminist article admits that female leaders are more likely to initiate violence, even in democracies, right? Or initiate conflict, right, on a political stage, right? And not these peacekeepers. So that is interesting, isn't it? Here is an article titled Female Leaders Can Be Hawkish on War Issues. But while many women may be opposed in principle to violence, once in the decision seat, women are slightly more likely than men to issue a call to arms. A Texas A&M University study of 22 democratic countries from 1970 to 2000 found that female chief executives presided over 3% higher defense spending, and female defense ministers were more likely to send their troops into battle. Wow, it's almost like women who have no skin in the game uh, during wartime, right? Because they're not conscripted mandatorily, they are more likely to send men into war, right? Who are used as cannon fodder in wars. Isn't that interesting? And here's also this. Sorry, Sheryl Sandberg, but women do go to war. And it says here, from the ancient world to the contemporary, evidence abounds of women being eminently capable at military command, political maneuvering, and bloodlust. One only needs to look as far back as Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, and Margaret Thatcher for confirmation of this. Stateswomen, much like statesmen, understand that war is sometimes a necessary evil. They too understand that war can be beneficial, thrilling, or politically popular. Statistically, in fact, women have been more likely to go to war than men. So there you have it, with the whole men make the war machine, right? Now, then you have this fact, right? The White Feathers campaign, where feminists shamed young men to enlist into war, right? The first World War. So if back in the day this was a patriarchy, why did women have the power to shame men into joining war, right? I mean, patriarchy was, if we remember, was defined as basically men having positions of power through customs and social norms. Yet we see feminist women are shaping social norms for men to go in war. And that was back in the day, back when the suffragettes movement came up. So this already is this already is not predicted by patriarchy theory at all, and the so-called patriarchy theory of history. Now let's look at why aren't so many women in like political positions or business leadership positions and all of that stuff, right? Because this is like the main thrust of patriarchy theory, basically. There are more male politicians and there are more male CEOs and all of that shit. Let's actually look at why that is, right? Is it because men just withhold these positions of power from women, and women just are eager to go into these positions of power, but men just are holding them back, supposedly? Let's actually look at that, right? So this is from the Institute of Leadership and Management, titled Ambition and Gender at Work. And it says right here, women are also more likely than men to voluntarily step off the career ladder, impeding their progress. 42% had taken stationary maternity leave, and 21% had left work to care for children. Only 9% of men had taken paternity leave, and just 2% had left work to care for children. So, again, let me read this again. Women are also more likely than men to voluntarily step off the career ladder. Voluntarily. No, no mention of men holding women back. But they voluntarily step off the career ladder. Isn't that interesting? And it's also here a fact that men want powerful jobs more than women do. Now, I referenced the study also in my last video, but you can see here the summarized findings. Having surveyed a diverse sample of more than 4,000 men and women, a team of social scientists report a list of potentially controversial findings. Compared to men, women have more life goals, but fewer of them are focused on power. Women perceive professional power as less desirable than men do. Women anticipate more negative outcomes from attaining a high power position. Women are less likely than men to jump at opportunities for professional advancement. While women and men believe they are equally able to attain high-level leadership positions, men want that power more than women do. So, yeah. I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory, right? And it also explains things like the so-called gender pay gap, which is basically the gender earnings gap, right? Because men work longer hours and are also striving more towards positions of power and career advancement, while women less desire these things, right? Because let's face it, men have to prove themselves to be worthy in society. They have to work their ass off. Women are seen as worthy in society from the day that they are born. They don't have to do shit to be seen as worthy in society. But man's entire worth depends on his ability to attain resources and gain higher status and all of that shit. So, yeah. But there's even more evidence, right? And this article is relatively recent, and this article just obliterates, and I really mean obliterates, any notion that women are being not in positions of leadership because men hold them back or some crap like that, right? What's keeping women from management roles? A meta-analysis of 6 decades of studies shows that women aspire to leadership roles less often than men do. A meta-analysis of 6 decades of studies. This is huge. This is huge. Shepard, Netsheva, and collaborator Tanya Bulkushkina recently published a meta-analysis on women's workplace aspirations. The 7-year project traced the interests and ambitions of 138,000 men and women across 174 studies dating back to the 1960s, aggregating the data to analyze the gender gap and slicing it into categories such as age, industry, and time. They cast a wide net, tracking down published and unpublished papers, which was pivotal given that the researchers tend to abandon unpopular or unsurprising data, especially around hot button issues such as gender. This is known in academia as the file drawer problem. Quote, the results confirmed our suspicions that women are not as interested. Nitsheva says, the meta-analysis concluded that among the last 3 generations of workers, men have consistently displayed higher aspirations for leadership than women, even more so in male-dominated industries, and that the gender gap in aspirations didn't meaningfully shrink over time. Again and again, high schoolers imagined themselves in leadership roles, but a shift emerged among college students, with women seeing themselves as leaders less often, a trend that continued in adulthood. Wow. So this is actually bombshell. This studies a huge meta-analysis, and it confirms what we MRAs and anti-feminists have been preaching for decades. That there are less women in leadership positions, not because discrimination, not because men are holding them back, not because patriarchy holding them back, not because glass ceiling, but because women are not wanting these positions as much as men do, and are not as interested in these positions. It is that simple. And this meta-analysis confirms that, and the study before that also confirms that. Case closed. Case fucking closed on that. And when it comes to back in the day, right? Because people saying, oh, but women couldn't work back in the day or some shit like that. How about here? So wives didn't work in the good old days? Wrong, right? And this is a historian who wrote this article, right? And it says right here, the image of the angel of the house was very much a middle-class ideal and not a working-class reality. For most women, the luxury of being a housewife, simply caring for children, cooking and cleaning, and creating a peaceful haven for the hard-working husband who brought home the bread at the end of the day, was only ever an illusion created by the middle classes. Economics dictated that not only both parents, but in most cases the children as well, needed to work. So women were also working. This is what this confirms. And we even have more evidence for that. For example, there were female blacksmiths in history, right? So women weren't held back from doing these male, traditionally considered male jobs, right? So there were female blacksmiths, and you might be saying, oh, this might be just an exception, right? And yeah, it was kind of an exception, but not because men were holding women back, but as this article says here, although many women did not pursue a career in blacksmithing, This did not mean they could not, if they had the means to. A common misconception regarding female blacksmiths in history is that they were not allowed to do the work of men, and that is why there were relatively few women working in blacksmithing and other male-dominated trades. In reality, medieval guilds and other trade organizations that emerged throughout history generally had no issues with women taking over their husbands' businesses or becoming apprentices. Women were expected to be widowers or to have learned the trade from family members. So there you go. Women were women were allowed to do these male so-called male-dominated works and all kinds of works. So this feminist narrative that patriarchy in history hold women back from work is complete crap. And here's even a Marxist article titled "The Poverty of Patriarchy Theory," right? Which basically rejects the feminist patriarchy theory and seeks more to analyze the oppressions of people back in the day through the lens of class analysis, right? Let me give you this example from the whole article, and you should read all the articles. I will link them. The idea that male workers joined in an alliance with their male bosses to carry out the scheme so that they could get power over women is simply not borne out by the facts. Men did not rush into the family, chaining women to the kitchen sink and smothering them with babies' nappies. As late as 1919, it was reported in the NSW Legislative Assembly that there was a high proportion of bachelors in Australia. Annie Summers herself admits that many women resisted being forced into full-time domesticity, just as men resented being forced to support a number of dependent and unproductive family members. This goes some way to explaining why taming and domestication of the self-professed and independent man became a standard theme in late 19th century fiction, especially that written by women. So men had to be cajoled and ideologically convinced of the benefits of home life. They did not go out to enforce it. There you go. This typical traditional family life was not enforced by the man. Again, supporting the family members, the unproductive family members, was what the man had to do, right? So there was no advantage doing that. For the man, it was actually a disadvantage, and it still is. Now here is a report of cases, right, argued and determined in the Court of King's Bench from King George III, right? And this is also very interesting. This is very old. It is from 1808. And it says right here, first, there is no necessary incapacity arising barely from a consideration of the sex, which disqualifies a woman from executing this office. And secondly, even if there were some parts of the duty of overseer which which a woman could not execute in person, she may appoint a deputy. As so, the principal duties of the office consist in collecting the poor rates in the pariah, in setting the pariah accounts, and in providing work for the poor, all of which may be performed by a female. A woman is capable of serving almost all the offices in the kingdom, such as those of Queen, Marshal, Great Chamberlain, and Constable of England, the Champion of England, Commissioner of Service, Governor of a workhouse, Sexton, Keeper of the prison of the gatehouse of the Dean, and Chapter of Westminster, returning officer for members of Parliament, and Constable, the latter of which is in some respects judicial. It is well known, too, that the office of gaoler is frequently executed by a woman. So there you go. It is clear as day that women in England could execute all kinds of judicial powers, right? This declaration confirms this, that women were allowed to have these positions of power. And you might be saying, okay, this is England. What about, for example, Middle Eastern women? Okay, let's actually look into that. Okay, here is Public and Private Politics, Women in the Middle Eastern World by Nelson. And this is ethnographic evidence, right? It says right here, among the Bedouin of Cyrenaica, men may boast of their dominance over women, and certainly this might be expected with male informants channeling information to male ethnographers, but they are constrained in their actions by the control women possess over the preparation of food, the provision of hospitality, the comforts of shelter, and the reputation for honor. Men may control the economic resources, land, water, animals, the durable properties, but women control the products, utilization of the products, the dividends of their investments are granted to women, and through these they acquire legal rights in men. Bereft of controlling rights and property, women are nevertheless critical in its manipulation. They possess the legal right to protection and support against husband as daughter or sister of the man who holds the bright wealth. Women mediate between the two, make demands on the men as a right, and are giving public support. So you can clearly see that in pre-Islamic Middle East, because this paper is about pre-Islamic Middle East, women had considerable power and control over resources. And this paper also talks about how they would negotiate in wartime, and how the mothers had great influence over their sons and husbands, giving them advice and all of that. So, but you might be saying, okay, this was pre-Islamic. What about now? What about the Islamic Middle East? Okay, let's look at that. Let's look at the financial rights of the wife in Islam, for example. In Islam, women are guaranteed greater financial security than men. They have the right to receive marital gifts and to keep property and income present and future, for their security. No married woman is required to spend even a penny of her property and income on the family. She is entitled to full maintenance during marriage and during the waiting period after divorce, and in the event of a divorce, and if she has children, she is also entitled to child support. And it also says here, if a woman works and is not obligated to her work, the gain that she makes is her own. She is not obligated to spend any of it in her house unless she freely wants to do so. No matter how wealthy the wife is, the duty to provide for the wife, to eat, dress, and take care of the husband's financial aspects remains with her husband. So women can, in Islam, they can work and they can keep what they have earned, right? And the husband has to financially support the wife. So this narrative that feminists say that that Islam supposedly is oppressive to women is a total lie, right? Okay, but this is about the wife's and husband situation, right? What about the political situation? Okay, so it says here, most Arab men would accept a woman as their country's leader. So I could just end it with that, right? But you might be saying, okay, they might accept a woman as their country's leader, but it also says here, but BBC Arabic research also found they want the final word at home. So you might be saying, okay, this is patriarchal. Okay, let's actually look deeper into that. In domestic life, however, most, including a majority of women, said husbands should always have the final say on family decisions. So even though this is demanded by majority of men, this is also demanded by majority of women. So because patriarchy says these norms are enforced by men, right? That the man has the final say in the house. Meanwhile, also like I showed in the video, women actually call the shots in most of the family's house, and most of the couples, etc. They make more decisions than men in most couples, right? I've shown the Pew Research data on that. And when it comes to the Middle Eastern world, even women want that the husband has the final say. So this is actually not patriarchal, because if it was, then this would only be demanded by men. It wouldn't be demanded by women also, right? And again, when we keep in mind the financial rights of wives in Islam, you can clearly see why women actually want this lifestyle, right? Because they are maintained by their husband. It is that simple. Also, we need to keep in mind when we talk about women and politics, why are there less female politicians than male politicians, right? Is this because men are holding them back or some stuff like that? Or is it because, like we saw with the management positions and the business leadership positions, that they are less ambitious to get into these positions? Well, This article indicates, right, that women are less interested in politics. It says right here, women know less about politics than men worldwide. Regardless of gender equality, women are less likely to know about current affairs than men. The survey findings were consistent from Colombia to the UK. And it also says right here, ESRC researchers found that the frequency with which people watch news on television plays a role in gender gaps. Apart from Colombia and the US, the more people watch TV news, the better informed they tend to be. However, watching, reading, and listening to the news tend to be more male activities, particularly in Canada, Norway, UK, and US. So, women, according to this article, according to this study, are less likely to consume media that talks about politics. So that indicates that they are less likely, less less likely to be interested in politics. They are less interested in politics, which again would actually be an explanation of why there are less female politicians than male politicians. Because in order to start a political career, you actually have to have interest in politics, right? But the one of the best articles on this topic, right, is found here on this German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine. And this article is referencing really an interesting study, right, on this topic. Suddenly a candidate, fewer women join parties. If they get involved, they are more successful than men. A group of political scientists from the Berlin Institute for Parliamentary Research has shown in a study that the parties do not discriminate against women in their political careers, as is often claimed. In fact, the opposite is actually the case. When asked why women are still underrepresented in parliament, the scientists have a clear answer: self-selection. So it's up to the women themselves that they don't sit in parliament more often, at least by and large. According to the study, the thesis that women are disadvantaged in the political apparatus can be considered refuted, at least on a structural level. So there you go. This study confirms again what we MRAs and anti-feminists have always preached for years now, that no, women are not discriminated against in politics. There are fewer female politicians because of self-selection, because it's up to the women whether or not they choose such careers, and they don't choose that. So it's a matter of choice, not bias against women or discrimination. Okay, but what about America, right? Because we see so many male politicians, male presidents. But let's actually look at the power behind the throne, so to speak, right? Behind the scenes, America's first ladies exert powerful influence. Behind the scenes, while first ladies are often seen as motherly symbols of American womanhood, history shows these women can have considerable behind-the-scenes influence. Melania Trump had a top national security advisor fired in her husband's administration because she didn't like the way her staff was treated on a foreign trip by this advisor. So they can also determine who's around the president, says presidential historian Kate Anderson Brower, author of First Woman. Nancy Reagan was really the human resources department for her husband. She decided who would be in and who was out. And the same year she tried to push healthcare reforms through Congress, Clinton made a quiet suggestion to her husband. She's one of the reasons why Ruth Bader Ginsburg was on the Supreme Court, Anderson Brower says. She told her husband that she thought she would make an excellent Supreme Court justice. It's an example of soft power and how private conversations between spouses can have a huge impact on the country. These women are really strong. I think that they're consistently underestimated, and I think that's partially because women in our society are often underestimated, says Anderson Brower. So, as you can see, women, the first ladies, right, of United States presidents can actually heavily influence the presidential environment, right? The circle of people around the president, right, who can nudge him in certain positions, right, and certain policy positions and all of that political influence, right? And this is probably just the tip of the iceberg, what we know, how much influence behind the scenes the wives of presidents have, right? And also, this article is also very interesting. The impact of women on state legislative policies. Do women in public office make a difference? If so, what kind and under what circumstances? This study offers preliminary answers to these questions by examining the relationship between the percentage of women in state legislatures and their policy priorities. It also examines the impact women's legislators have on overall legislative policy. Findings reveal that women in states with high percentages of female representatives introduce and pass more priority bills dealing with issues of women, children, and families than men in their states, and more than their female counterparts in low representation legislators. Moreover, women can successfully diffuse their priorities throughout the legislative process in one of two ways: through high percentages of women in office or through the presence of a formal women's legislative caucus. These findings suggest that women do indeed make a difference and that their capacity to do so is related to the level of support from colleagues. So, to summarize, women actually have considerable political power, right? And if they're legislative, they care very much about women's issues, right? Which is interesting because you sometimes hear patriarchy hurts men too, right? And in one way, in which men are hurt, so to speak, is when resources are not distributed equally, right? For example, the latest example would be Denver, right, where there was a program set up where homeless women were giving funds, right? They were giving lots of money, but not the homeless men, right? And This is an example of the overemphasis of women's issues, right? But ignoring men's issues. And you can clearly see that women in politics, first and foremost, care about women's issues, as this article here shows. And these and this suggests that it is not patriarchy that diverts resources away from men's issues and thereby hurts men. So this notion that patriarchy hurts men too is debunked on that grounds also. So, and we have to also consider this, how the influence over the political system of women is actually growing, as this article suggests, right? And we know from my video that there are actually more women voting than male voting, right? And this article also says here, the shift is far from over. In other parts of society, most notably the famous Me Too movement, women's opposition to sexual harassment has been responsible for the downfall of many powerful men. Witnessing the type of change their numbers have brought in other parts of society in the last few years has only further whetted women's appetite for using their political power to wipe out the remaining vestiges of male privilege. Now, male privilege doesn't exist. And also other MRAs have destroyed that myth, and the type of behavior it condones. Would organizations such as Emily Liz and the Women's Campaign Fund providing a more robust infrastructure for female candidates, it won't be long before the political preferences of women voters determine the winners and losers in American politics. Now, I would argue that this is already the case, that women's preferences and women's voters determine the winners and losers in American politics. I would argue this is already the case because there are more women voting than men voting. And you can also clearly see that pretty much all politicians, they never talk about men's issues, they never talk about men's rights, they only talk about women's rights and women's empowerment. And we need to do more about women and to do more for women and all of that, right? And this article also admits that there are infrastructures in place for women's empowerment, right? Such as these women's campaign funds and other organizations, right? So how's this a patriarchy if the definition of patriarchy is a society in which opportunity is withheld from women, right? And opportunity is withheld from women, yet we see all these initiatives, all these organizations that providing infrastructure for female candidates, female empowerment, all of that. That's very curious, isn't it? Now, what about the judicial system in the United States, for example, in the here and now? Now, from this data, we can see that there are just as many male judges and just as many female judges. Gender parity, it's 50-50. So, yeah, that's pretty much on that, right? There's no patriarchy to be seen here either. You might be saying, but what about countries like Afghanistan, where we hear in the news, for example, that female judges are hunted by the Taliban, for example, and by men who were sentenced by female judges, for example. Well, even if that might be the case, what you won't often hear in the news is how male judges in Afghanistan are treated, right? The fate of male judges in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover. Thousands of prisoners were released. Now they want to take revenge on the judges and prosecutors who sentenced them. After the fall of Kabul, a number of female Afghan judges left Afghanistan with the assistance of human rights institutions. However, the frequent requests for help by male judges under threat from the Taliban have not received any response up to now. So, male judges are not helped by these organizations who flee from the Taliban. Isn't that interesting? And unfortunately, I couldn't read the whole article here, right? It's for subscribers only. And this is the only article that I found who talked about this, right? But we can imagine that these male judges will not be treated nicely by these released prisoners, right? And at least the female judges could flee the situations, and international human rights organizations and institutions help them, but not the male judges, right? So I just wanted to bring that up. I found that really interesting. Now, there was also a comment from Valab about the media being in control by men, right? Let's actually look at that, right? Is it true that women have no power over the media whatsoever? Well, according to this statistics here, when it comes to social media director demographics and statistics in the US, we find more female social media directors than male social media directors, right? 57% female and 43% male social media directors. So, but, you know, who cares about social media, right? That probably hasn't any influence on society, right? But yeah, here's also USA Today newsroom, now majority female, right? This is a major US news site. And here are 21 women running US media organizations. And you can see here the names are listed. Executive editor of the Associated Press, editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post, editor-in-chief of National Geographic magazine, director of Voice of America, editor and publisher of The Nation, editor-in-chief of Mother Jones magazine, editor of Newsday, editor of the Houston Chronicle, editor of the US Guardian, CEO and editor-in-chief of Chalkbeat, publisher of Vox Media, CEO of News Deeply, executive editor of the Miami Herald, executive editor of Texas Monthly, editor-in-chief of The Intercept, publisher of BuzzFeed, editor of Time Magazine, editor of Politico, editor of Bloomberg Businessweek, president and CEO of PBS, editor-in-chief of the USA Today Network, right? And those are newspapers that millions and millions of people read. Millions. And this list is even inconclusive or incomplete, as it states here. So, yeah. But women have no influence over the media, really? And this is just your US example, right? And keep in mind, with this in mind, right? How are men actually portrayed in the media? Men become the main target in the new gender wars, right? Over 6 months, the study involved detailed analysis of over 2,000 media articles and program segments. Dr. McNamara found that by volume, 69% of mass media reporting and commentary on men was unfavorable. So roughly 70% was was negative. The reporting about men, or the portrayal of men in the media, is largely very negative. And again, women definitely have an influence over that. So yeah. But what about voting? Because we always hear women couldn't vote, and that's why they were so oppressed in the past and all of that. Okay, now let's start with this. Women voted 75 years before they were legally allowed to in 1918. A new document has surfaced which shows British women of all classes voting in 1843, some 75 years before they received the parliamentary franchise in 1918. So yeah, this is actually very interesting, isn't it, right? They could vote of all classes, right? Already in 1843, right? What about the men of all classes, though? Universal manhood suffrage, right? On 6th February 2018, celebrations were held across Britain to commemorate the centenary of the 1918 Representation of the People Act, which gave some women the right to vote for the first time. While this was pivotal for women's suffrage, it was also an important milestone for men's suffrage. Prior to the act, property qualifications had been used to control the electorate, excluding most working class men from voting. Despite attempts to satisfy concerns of democratic inequality, the reform acts of the 19th century continued to avoid universal manhood suffrage. The fourth and final Reform Act of 1918 was the first time male suffrage was achieved. So here we learned that it was more of an class issue about voting and less of a gender issue, right? And even if legally women were slightly behind in terms of legal voting rights, they still exercised their franchise before they were even legally allowed to, right? So yeah, this had more to do with property rights, especially for men, right? They had to own land. It was not for the most majority of men that they could vote, right? And when it comes to America, right, this is also very interesting, right? Because what if I tell you that many women actually didn't want to vote, right? So this comes from a study from 1924, right? And you can see in this table here, if you can read it, that they give certain reasons why they did not exercise their franchise, right? Back in the day, both women and men. And now, for example, one of the most cited reasons for not voting by women was general indifference to particular election, and this was 30%, right? And there, and also 11% disbelieving in women's voting, right? And this is what women themselves said, right? And another reason was illness. But interestingly, only 1% of these women cited objections of husband. Only 1% said objections of husband was the reason why they didn't vote. So this notion that women were not allowed to vote because their husbands didn't allow it is nonsense. The majority reason, or the most cited reason for why women who didn't vote was because general indifference to the particular election. And one of the second cited reasons was, or the third most cited reasons was disbelieving in women's voting. That's very interesting, isn't it? And what did actually happen once women gained the suffrage, right? Because even after that, supposedly, there was still patriarchy, right? Supposedly. Now, this paper examines the growth of government during this century as a result of giving women the right to vote. Using cross-sectional time series data from 1870 to 1940, we examined state government expenditures and revenue as well as voting by U.S. House and Senate state delegations and the passage of a wide range of different state laws. Suffrage coincided with immediate increase in state government expenditures and revenue and more liberal voting patterns for federal representatives, and these effects continued growing over time as more women took advantage of the franchise. Contrary to many recent suggestions, the gender gap is not something that has arisen since the 1970s, and it helps explain why American government started growing when it did. So, and also what I want to say is when they say liberal voting patterns, they mean feminist voting patterns, right? Women's issues and all of that. However, this clearly shows that women had and still have considerable amount of influence over politics when after that franchise the government expanded, right? So you want to tell me we live in a patriarchal society in which women don't have influence, they don't have power. Meanwhile, they can expand the government. That is some huge influence, actually. But what about men's voting today, right? Because as we shall see, women, they have their voting rights. When it comes to male voting rights, however, today that is, well, difficult. Let's put it that way, right? So who can and can't vote in US elections, right? And who can't vote? Non-citizens and some people following felony convictions. or who are currently serving time for other types of crimes. So those who are convicted of a felony, or those who are non-citizens, cannot vote usually in the United States. And you know who is guilty of a felony in the United States? Men who fail to register for selective service, aka male-only draft, right? If required to register with selective service, failure to register is a felony, punishable by a fine up to $250,000 and or 5 years imprisonment. So men actually can only vote in the United States if they sign up for the male-only draft. Think about that for a second. And there is felony disenfranchisement. For example, as of 2008, over 5.3 million people in the United States were denied the right to vote due to felony disenfranchisement. So that means if men don't sign up for the male-only draft, if they don't sign up for being used as cannon fodder in imperialist wars, then they cannot vote. And this is going on today, right? So men don't even have full voting rights like women do. Isn't that interesting? And again, also laws are much more harsher on men, and the criminal justice system is much harsher on men. I have shown this in dozens of videos now, and that's why men are much more likely to be convicted of a felony and much more likely to lose their voting rights, right? But you won't hear feminists make a peep about that, right? Men are not having full voting rights today. Now, let's also look at that, right? Because we often hear this cliche that back in the day it was legal for the husband to beat up their wives, right? With domestic violence, right? This is a common feminist myth, but it was actually the other way around, actually. Skimmington Revisited. While men as perpetrators of violence on wives or female partners could be prosecuted or subject to public exposure, ironically, men as victims of their wives' violence were subject to punishment. So it was actually the other way around. It was the wife who could get away with beating up their husband, right? And he was even the one who got punished after that, and publicly punished during medieval times. Let that sink in for a second, right? And here's an example also of that, right? This is from 1906. Woman horsewhips husband and boasts about it in the newspaper. Wow. And also says here by the person who uploaded this, powerless people do not whip their oppressors in broad daylight and then brag about it to the newspaper, with no negative consequences for doing so. Yeah, this is the oppressive, brutal patriarchy back in the day, right? Where women can just beat up their husband in broad daylight and brag about it in the newspaper with impunity. Isn't that interesting, is it? And again, this is from 1906. And here's another example, right? The Man-Hating Club. And this is from 1904. You want to tell me that back in the day everything was so patriarchal and women were oppressed throughout history. Meanwhile, they had the main man-hating club, where only women were allowed, by the way. So why didn't the patriarchy just dissolve this club, right? If back in the day, if throughout history, women were powerless and oppressed, and there was this patriarchy, this almighty patriarchy, why was there such a thing as the man-hating club even allowed to exist? Isn't that contradictory? Well, yeah, it is actually, right? And now let's actually look at something that you should really read in its entirety on your own, right? This is by Ernest Belfort Bax, right? The Legal Subjugation of Men from 1908. And Ernest Belfort Bax was a barrister, an English barrister, and a Marxist. And he has written a lot about how men are, or how men back in his day were discriminated against, especially by the justice system, right? And this is something we want to look into. But of course, I cannot read from this whole pamphlet. You can read this yourself, but I will give you some paragraphs from it, right? So it says here, maintenance. As against her husband, the law confers on a woman who has married him the unilateral privilege of maintenance. The earlier law made this privilege dependent on her obedience, cohabitation with her husband, and her observance of outwardly decent behavior. The present law has set her free from all these restraints. Since 1857, the secular court, which then assumed jurisdiction in matrimonial matters, has given up all attempts to enforce obedience, but the most violent methods, including imprisonment and sequestration of the property of the husband, are employed to enforce her claim to maintenance. So women have to be maintained by their husband due to law back in the day, back in the 19th century. So this is the so-called patriarchy you want to talk about, where women were entitled to be maintained by their husband, and this is enshrined in law, really? But I give you more examples. Impunity to murder the husband. Exactly as in the case of bigamy, the law on murder and homicide are nominally the same for men as for women, but if a wife by poisoning or violence kills her husband, the administrators of the law show in practice what can be done by twisting a text. The matter will again be referred to under the criminal law, but provisionally the rules may be reduced to form somewhat as follows. First, the least excuse is sufficient to reduce the crime from murder to manslaughter. Second, all the wife's statements against her husband are assumed to be true until they are proven to be false. Third, the proof of the actual deed of crime must be much more conclusive than in the case of a man. Fourth, if the verdict be by a mere chance of murder, a sympathetic judge announces he will forward to the proper quarter the sympathetic jury's recommendation to mercy. This recommendation is acted on by the Home Secretary as a matter of course in the case of a woman. Fifth, if the verdict is, as usually is, one of manslaughter, a shamefully inadequate or possibly a merely nominal sentence is imposed. So as you can see, it was the case in the 19th century that women were barely punished for even murdering their husband. Barely punished, and all kinds of excuses were made. And her word was believed until proven to be false, right? So the same problem that we have now, right, where women avoid jail and all of that, was present back in so-called patriarchal times, right? And here's also a summary of the chief privileges of women in the civil court that he gives here. First, freedom from arrest for debt if married. Second, property of married woman exempt from seizure. Third, privilege to commit breaches of contract. Fourth, privilege to defraud. Fifth, privilege to seduce. Sixth, privilege to commit adultery. Seventh, privilege to insult. Eighth, privilege to assault. Ninth, privilege to waylay. 10th, privilege to libel and slander. Those are the privileges and many more that barrister Ernst Alfred Bucks could witness during his time as a barrister, right? They could do many things that men couldn't do in regards to the justice system. They had many privileges, and men were thrown in prison just like that, right? On a drop of a hat, which is basically the same situation now as it was back then, right? So yeah, I mean, this is what the so-called patriarchal history was, right? And I advise you to read this book by Ernest Balfour Bucks in its entirety, right? I think it also goes over child custody and all of that, and it just debunks many feminist myths, right? That women supposedly were oppressed back in the day. They were not. They were not. They were privileged even back in the 19th century and before that, right? And yeah, also Valab in one of his or her comments said that soon these so-called gender wars, how this person called it, will be over, and in the future there will be supposedly a transhumanist future and the singularity will rule. He literally said that, right? Or this person literally said that. Let me pull this comment up. And there it is, right? Nevertheless, a few decades from now, the gender battles that we see today will come to an end. The human society in the future will mostly transform into the transhuman slash post-human society where singularity will rule. Now this is, I mean, this is some Alex Jones shit, to be honest. I mean, okay. I mean, this is not my field of expertise, right? Technological progress and all of that. But this is speculation. And this is debated among scientists. What will the future look like, right? And to give you an example, right? I mean, this singularity idea was popularized by this guy Ray Kurzweil, I think is his name, right? He's a futurist, but there's also pushback against this theory or this prediction, right? For example, Alan, the singularity isn't near. The singularity isn't near is an article in MIT Technology Review by Paul Allen, which argues that a singularity brought about by superhuman level AI will not arrive by 2045, as is predicted by Kurzweil. The summarized argument: we will not have human level AI by 2045. To reach human level AI, we need software as well as hardware. To get the software, we need one of the following: a detailed scientific understanding of the brain, a way to duplicate brains, creation of something equivalent to a brain from scratch. A detailed scientific understanding of the brain is unlikely by 2045. First, to have enough understanding by 2045, we would need a massive acceleration of scientific progress. We are just scraping the surface of understanding the foundation of human cognition. A massive acceleration of progress in brain science is unlikely. Science progresses irregularly. The discovery of long-term potentiation, the columnar organization of cortical areas, neuroplasticity. Science doesn't seem to be exponentially accelerating. There is a complexity break. The more we understand, the more complicated the next level to understand is. And also says duplicating brains is unlikely by 2045. And you can read the rest yourself, but there's definitely some pushback against this idea. And also says here, singularity is not near, but why? Abstract, the technological singularity is a hypothesized time in the near future where machine intelligence surpasses humans. Many people consider it a threat to humanity, while others think it will augment humans to a much higher level physiologically and psychologically. In this paper, I review the state of the art of computing and conclude that singularity will not happen in the near future because of the physical limits of silicon-based computing paradigm. Alternative paradigms are not promising enough to drive the observed potential growth into the future. Even if artificial general intelligence is possible in the future, it is unnecessary to worry about the bad AI scenario. Instead, we need to worry about the stupidity of machines. AI-related research should be encouraged in order to find the real problems and their solutions. In order to regulate AI, we can treat them as legal persons like companies. And you can read this whole article yourself. I won't go deeper into that because it's not my field of expertise, to be honest. Maybe singularity will happen, maybe it won't. It is contested. This is all I'm saying. It is debated, it is contested, right? But this valid commenter said, like, he was so sure, or this person was so sure that this is going to happen definitely, right? So, but I'm pretty sure he's not an expert in this either, right? And maybe environmental destruction or nuclear war will destroy the earth before that. So who knows, right? We have to focus on the here and now and on the actual issues at hand. But just as a side note, right? Talking about technology, rise of the fembots, why artificial intelligence is often female, right? Because let's face it, if there is some artificial intelligence revolution, it's gonna be anti-male and female biased. Definitely. Definitely. Because it was created by humans, and humans have an anti-male, pro-female bias. It is that simple, right? And it even says here, the men in the study reported that they preferred female voices, but they showed no implicit preference for them, whereas the women in the study implicitly preferred female voices to male ones, even more than they admitted in the questionnaire. Wow. It's almost as if women have more of an in-group bias and men actually don't have an in-group bias and are actually hostile to other men, and women care much more about women. Wow. But yeah, I mean, I pretty much have obliterated patriarchy, and also from a historical perspective, I have shown you evidence that women self-select into positions in society and are not held back in society. I've shown you that voting rights was more of a class issue, and also many men couldn't vote, but women could vote even before it was legal for them. I showed you that many women actually weren't interested in voting. I showed you that women in general are not interested in politics, which explains why there are less female politicians, right? So you cannot blame it on some patriarchy or whatever. I showed you that it was actually women who could get away with beating their husband back in the past, right? And also, unfortunately, now even, right? And all kinds of examples, right? They could work. They had high-level influence. They could inherit property. They had to be maintained by law by their husband, even though they could themselves keep property and all of that. All these sources show that. All these lines of evidence show that patriarchy is bullshit, was bullshit, it never existed, and it doesn't exist in the here and now, definitely not. And like I said before, men don't even have their full voting rights. It is tied to the draft, to the male-only draft. So yeah, and yeah, I mean, Valab is just a tradcon, to be honest, and I will end this video on this note, right? Here's an excellent quote by Ernest Belfort Bax. Muscular inferiority and sex privilege. Quote, we must once more refer, on account of its wide-spreading popularity, to the cheap sneer by which some small but gallant wits may endeavor to turn the edge of the foregoing observations, namely, the attempt to play off the muscular inferiority of women to men as an answer to any allegations of oppression exercised on behalf of the so-called weaker sex. When looked at fairly in the face, the point in question will he seen so preposterously absurd as to be hardly worth answering, but nevertheless absurd it is. It undoubtedly plays a part, half unconsciously, in the apathy most men on the question of female privilege. Because men are muscularly stronger than women, it is felt by many, and the feeling is supported by the class of cheap wittism above referred to, that therefore it is impossible for men to be seriously oppressed by women. A moment's reflection suffices to show that the question of muscular strength or weakness is absolutely immaterial to the issue. It would be just as reasonable to suppose that because the Tsar of Russia and his high officials were less muscular developed than the average Russian peasant, that the possibility of the Russian peasant being seriously oppressed by the Tsar of his government was a proposition to be laughed at. The weakest and most frail woman, backed by the whole power of the state, may easily annihilate by the state forces summoned by her scream a legion of Samsons or Hercules. End quote.